Today we're going to be talking about my own personal review of the EOS RP. So I'm not really going to be going into all of the specifications. This video is really just going to be about what I think the major strengths and weaknesses of this camera are. So here is the camera without a lens on it, and as you can see, compared to my hands, it's a pretty compact camera. Yeah, I could easily fit this into a day pack and keep everything really light. Here's what it looks like with the 50mm RF lens on it. So even though it's a bigger lens, it's still a pretty compact setup right there. So one thing I absolutely love about this camera, especially coming from Nikon, is the flip out screen. So in terms of the actual look of the camera and the style, I do like it. It's pretty modern and it's a very simplistic design, and what I do like about it is all of the buttons and dials on here that are customizable in conjunction with the control ring that's on the new RF lenses. That's going to give you all of the control that you really need to easily switch your settings on the fly. There's two things that I don't really like about the setup of the camera. I don't like that the on-off button is on the left side of the camera. Coming from Nikon, I was able to switch the camera on and off really fast and pretty much do everything with one hand, which was really nice. It also took me a little while to get used to the placement of the autofocus back button. Come on, focus. So it's right here. It definitely seems like it's in an awkward spot. It took me about a week to get used to it. I feel like it should probably be an inch to the left, maybe, but I might just have bigger hands, so it's not a super big deal. Even though my pinky does hang off the bottom a little bit, I don't really find myself wanting to buy the extra extension grip just because I like how small the camera is. And the idea of paying more money to make it bigger just seems a little bit backwards, but if it is really uncomfortable, they sell a grip that you can put on the bottom of this. The sole purpose of the grip is to make the camera body a little bit bigger and a little bit more comfortable to hold. So if you are going to buy RF lenses for this camera, it's good to know that there's probably going to be an imbalance between the camera size and the camera lens size. So I'm going to put on 3 different RF lenses on this Canon EOS RP just to show you how the lenses compare in size to the actual body. So here is the Canon RF 24 to 105mm f4. Alright, here's the camera with the 50mm f1.2 RF lens on it. It's a little bit bigger than the 24 to 105 combo, but still a decent match right there. It's not too imbalanced. Okay, and here is the Canon EOS RP with the 85mm 1.2 lens on it. Yeah, so as you will see, this 85mm is pretty big, especially compared to the actual body. It feels a little bit weird, and even though there is that imbalance, I don't really mind it, but it's definitely something that you should keep in mind. This is probably when it would be nice to have that extension grip, just because the lens is actually pretty heavy too. I bet if I got a hand strap though, it would help. So shooting this camera is kind of weird for me. When I shot with my Nikon gear, I usually always use the viewfinder, but with this camera I find myself using the LCD screen more. Yeah, I don't really know if it was because the D850's optical viewfinder was a lot nicer than this electronic viewfinder, or if it's just too small, but I don't really find myself using it a lot. Yeah, I find it's just easier to actually look at a bigger screen to see what I'm taking a picture of. Something that you might not know about the RF lenses is if you are using them with the Canon EOS RP, you can set your electronic viewfinder to a high performance mode, and it'll increase the refresh rate of the viewfinder. That'll make it easier to take pictures of moving subjects or anything for sports, although this camera isn't really that great for sports just because of the slow continuous shooting mode. You only get 4 frames per second if you are in continuous autofocus. I think that's really it for the design of the camera. I do like how simplistic and modern the design is, and paired with the RF lenses, it definitely is a nice looking camera. Even though these RF lenses are awesome, there is a downside to pairing them with the Canon EOS RP when compared to pairing them with a Canon EOS R. And that downside has to do with the EFCS limitation, which I mentioned in a previous video, which I will link right here, but I'll touch on that in just a little bit. Like I said, the compact size of this camera is pretty awesome. Even with this bigger 85mm on the camera, it's still a lot lighter than a lot of the Nikon combos that I was working with. So when Canon does finally come out with the 1.8 lenses and just more compact lenses in general, I think that they'll be absolutely perfect for this body, and you won't run into as many of those EFCS limitations that I'll talk about in a little bit. I'm also going to look into adapters for adapting vintage lenses. I do have a couple of M42 mount lenses that I'd like to see how they perform on this. I do think that the biggest selling point for this camera is the value. I was able to purchase my first EOS RP in a kit with a 24-105 for about $1,500, and then my second EOS RP body was only $750. It was slightly used, but pretty much in brand new condition. So this camera is great for anyone getting into photography or videography. From some of the interviews that I read with Canon representatives, it does seem like the autofocus acquisition on this camera is just as good as the one on the EOS R, which is awesome. And even though the weather sealing isn't as good as the one on the EOS R, this camera is still considered to be weather sealed. The difference is that the Canon EOS RP is weather sealed through tighter fitting parts, and the Canon EOS R actually used gaskets to weather seal the camera even further. So I would say for me, the major weakness of this camera is that it only uses an electronic front curtain shutter. I would love to be able to use a mechanical shutter with this. So since I did talk about those EFCS limitations in my previous video, I won't go over everything again, but again, when you're shooting with a faster lens at higher shutter speeds with this camera, you're gonna start seeing some strange effects with your out of focus areas. That just means that those specular highlights in the background that show up as circles or ovals are gonna start looking weird. They'll clip, they'll start fading out. You're gonna get loss of light, so your picture will actually be underexposed a little bit. Something I didn't mention in my previous video was that if you're using a flash or an external flash, you're gonna get banding when you're using high-speed sync. The banding will start to occur when you're using faster shutter speeds, and I can show you an example of that right now. Something else that I don't like about this camera is that the battery life is pretty horrible, which you probably already know if you watched any of the review videos on the Canon EOS RP on YouTube, but it is worth mentioning that you probably can get a third-party battery grip that'll hold 2 to 3 batteries that'll extend the battery life. I just don't know how safe it is to use those, and I don't know if it's going to have some kind of adverse effect on the camera in the long run. So I know I talked about a lot of the reasons why it sucks that you can't turn off the EFCS on this camera, but there are some good things about using an EFCS, and that is that it reduces shutter shock. Shutter shock is something that you would get from a mechanical shutter, and it's basically the first mechanical curtain coming down, hitting the camera, and causing it to vibrate. So if you replace that with an electronic front curtain shutter, you're not going to get that vibration. Also, with an EFCS, you'll be able to get a quieter shutter sound. This came in handy in a recent wedding that I did when I was shooting in a church. At that time, I was shooting with my Nikon and this camera, and I actually just kind of switched to primarily shooting with this instead of the Nikon, just because the Nikon was so much louder than this camera. Sometimes I do wish that the actual shutter sound on this was a little bit more pleasant. It sounds kind of cheap. Let me see if you can hear it. When I used to shoot with Fuji, I loved the shutter sound on my X Pro 2. So if you ever get a chance to buy a Fuji, you should do it, just to check out the shutter sound. Some other things that I noticed when shooting time-lapse with this camera, I couldn't really figure out how to get to a more customizable setting with the shutter speed and the aperture when I was shooting a time-lapse video. So when you actually switch this into video mode on the camera, you'll get an option to shoot a time-lapse in the menu. But the issue was I couldn't figure out how to set it to aperture or shutter priority when I was in the time-lapse mode. The reason that's an issue is that doing a more complex scene like a day to night or a night to day time-lapse requires that you have more control over the aperture and shutter settings. So if anyone knows how to do that with this camera, let me know. Otherwise, I don't think you can do it. If you guys have any questions about this camera, please let me know below in the comments section. And if you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe so I can get you more videos on the Canon EOS RP and the RF lenses in general. I'll leave you guys with some video footage and pictures that I took with this camera. I hope you enjoy, and I will talk to you later.